At 5:58 in the morning, while most of Flores Island was still asleep, the ground exploded. Not slowly, not with a warning. It happened in an instant. A magnitude 7.7 earthquake, one of the most powerful to strike this region in decades, ripped open the seafloor just 68 kilometers off the northern coast and sent shockwaves tearing through the earth at thousands of miles per hour. Buildings cracked. Roofs collapsed mid-sentence. People were thrown from their beds onto floors that would not stop moving. Within minutes, before the dust had even settled, a government alert was screaming at every coastal community for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Get away from the water right now, do not wait. This happened on August 15th, 2026, in eastern Indonesia, and by the time the world caught up, the story had already turned far darker than anyone expected in those first chaotic hours. Stay with me, because this is one of the deadliest earthquakes to strike Indonesia in years, and the full picture of what happened, what it cost, and what it means is something every single person watching needs to understand. Let's start with the raw science of what hit Flores Island that morning, because the numbers are genuinely shocking. The United States Geological Survey, the agency that tracks seismic activity worldwide, registered this quake at magnitude 7.7. That is not a number thrown around casually. The magnitude scale is logarithmic, so a 7.7 is not slightly bigger than a 7.0. It releases dramatically more energy. It is the kind of earthquake that fundamentally changes landscapes, liquefying ground beneath ports, collapsing bridges, dropping buildings that had stood for decades into rubble in under 60 seconds. The depth was recorded at just 10 kilometers below the seafloor. That is critically important. Shallow earthquakes, anything under roughly 70 kilometers, are the most dangerous category, because the energy has less distance to travel before reaching the surface, meaning the shaking is more intense, sudden, and destructive, right at the point of impact. This was not a deep rumble that gradually faded. This was a shallow, violent rupture that hit the surface like a hammer swing. The epicenter sat about 68 kilometers north-northwest of Ende, in East Nusa Tenggara province, in the Flores Sea off the island's northern coast, a location scientists have watched with concern for a long time. The reason is something called the Flores back arc thrust, a fault system along the north coast of the Lesser Sunda Islands, formed by the Indo-Australian plate grinding beneath the Eurasian plate at roughly 80 millimeters a year. That is one of the most stressed fault zones on the planet. This same system produced one of Indonesia's worst historical disasters, the 1992 Flores earthquake, also magnitude 7.7 along the same coastline. That quake killed more than 2,500 people, roughly half of them not from shaking, but from the tsunami that followed within minutes, waves reportedly reaching as high as 26 meters, over 85 feet, sweeping through coastal villages before people had a chance to run. This morning, the world woke up to a haunting echo of that scenario. Same fault system, same island, same magnitude. The immediate aftermath was captured through emergency broadcasts, local media, and witness accounts, and what they describe is organized chaos in the best sense of the word. People running, sirens going off, entire neighborhoods evacuating toward higher ground in the dark hours of early morning. Indonesia's National Disaster Management Agency, known as BNPB, was among the first to confirm casualties. Deaths were reported at the Maumere port, in one of the largest towns on Flores Island, a place with a population approaching 90,000 people that has lived with the trauma of a nearly identical earthquake before. In 1992, Maumere was devastated. The seafront was wiped out, buildings collapsed, and locals there have passed down the stories of that day for more than 30 years. This morning, those same people woke up to shaking that felt like history repeating itself. Local media footage circulating online showed extensive damage across the Maumere area, visible along the waterfront and through the downtown core. Further west, in Riung, AFP photographers captured images of shattered houses, walls cracked apart, ceilings pulled down, debris filling what used to be family rooms. One of the most dramatic eyewitness accounts to emerge in the immediate hours came from a seminary. Students at St. Peter Major Seminary in Sica, known locally as Rita Pirit Seminary on the predominantly Catholic island of Flores, were in the middle of morning mass when the earthquake struck. The rector described the scene, students and nuns running out in panic as the roof of an assembly hall began collapsing above them. At least one priest suffered a broken leg, not from debris falling on him, but from jumping out of a second-floor window to escape while the building came apart around him. Think about that for a moment. A priest, in the middle of morning mass, making the split-second decision to jump from a second-floor window because staying inside was no longer survivable. That is the violence of a 7.7 earthquake. That is what 10 kilometers of depth and a shallow seafloor rupture does to a structure built on land. The USGS published shaking estimates that frame just how many people were caught inside this event. Around 56,000 people are estimated to have experienced severe shaking. Roughly 420,000 felt very strong shaking. More than 1 million felt strong shaking, and several million more across a much wider area felt moderate to strong ground motion. In Makassar, a major city roughly 400 kilometers northwest of the epicenter, residents felt the quake strongly, with shaking reportedly lasting close to 2 full minutes. If you have never experienced that, it is almost impossible to describe how long 2 minutes of solid ground shaking feels. It feels like it will never stop. Indonesia's National Meteorology, Climatology, and Geophysics Agency, known as BMKG, moved immediately. Within minutes, they issued a tsunami warning covering coastlines across East Nusa Tenggara, West Nusa Tenggara, South Sulawesi, and Southeast Sulawesi, 4 provinces placed under alert simultaneously, with 22 individual areas designated under alert status. Estimated arrival times ranged from just a few minutes after the quake to well over an hour for more distant coastlines, a window of uncertainty that makes early warning absolutely critical. A senior BNPB official went on national television with an urgent, unambiguous message: move more than 2 kilometers inland or climb to ground at least 10 meters above sea level. Move away from the shore. Evacuate immediately. The language of disaster officials is almost always measured, and when they start using words like immediately, you listen. Now here is where the story takes a significant turn that matters for context. Tsunami waves were recorded, but they were small, under 1 meter at several coastal sites, with the highest observation near Enda. After everything this region has been through after 1992, after the devastating 2018 tsunami that struck Palu on Sulawesi and killed thousands, that these waves stayed under a meter deserves to be acknowledged plainly. Indonesia's warning was eventually lifted, and Australia confirmed no threat to its mainland or territories. The worst case, ocean-wide scenario, did not materialize, but a small tsunami does not mean the danger was not real, or that the warning was wrong, or that people were wrong to run. The difference between a small tsunami and a catastrophic one can come down to the precise geometry of the rupture, factors scientists can only calculate with confidence after the fact. In the moment, with a shallow, tsunami-capable fault rupturing at 7.7, evacuating immediately was exactly the correct response, and it almost certainly saved lives. The earthquake was followed almost immediately by a relentless sequence of aftershocks. Within 30 minutes, seismologists had already recorded 3 significant ones, magnitude 5.9, magnitude 5.6, and then a 6.1 that commanded attention on its own. In most of the world, a 6.1 quake would be the headline story of the day by itself, large enough to collapse already weakened structures, trigger new landslides, and send tsunami systems back to high alert. And the aftershocks did not stop there. In the days that followed, authorities logged well over 200 additional tremors across Flores, with some reports tracking the total past 300, the strongest measuring above magnitude 6. When a 7.7 main shock is followed by that kind of sustained sequence, the danger is not over. It is ongoing, day after day, for people trying to sleep, search for the missing, and simply stay upright on ground that keeps twitching beneath them. As the hours turned into days, the picture that first looked survivable turned devastating. The earliest confirmed reports out of Momere spoke of just 2 deaths at the port. But as rescue teams pushed further inland, into regencies that had been cut off by landslides and severed communication lines, the toll climbed with brutal speed. Indonesia's National Disaster Management Agency reported dozens of deaths, concentrated in 3 regencies in particular: Manggarai, East Manggarai, and Sika, where entire hillside communities had taken the worst of the shaking. By the following day, the confirmed death toll had passed 50. By the time Indonesia marked its Independence Day just 1 day after the quake, with President Prabowo Subianto leading a nationwide moment of silence for the victims during the official ceremony in Jakarta, the toll had climbed toward 70, with officials warning it would likely rise further as rescue crews reached the most isolated villages. More than 200 people were reported injured. Roughly 5,000 residents were forced into temporary shelters. Search and rescue officials in Nagakeo Regency, the area closest to the epicenter, described roads blocked by landslides and communication towers knocked out entirely, forcing rescue teams to attempt reaching survivors by ferry because the roads simply could not be used. The scale of physical destruction across Flores became staggering as assessments came in. More than 3,200 homes were reported damaged across East Nusa Tenggara, with close to 250 completely destroyed on Flores alone. Dozens of schools, health facilities, houses of worship, and government offices sustained damage significant enough to be logged in official assessments. The Trans-Flores Highway, the roughly 700-kilometer road that is the main artery connecting communities across this mountainous island, was cut in multiple places by landslides, giant boulders sent tumbling down slopes that had been shaken loose by the quake and its aftershocks. Fallen trees blocked secondary roads. Homes were crushed onto parked cars. Villagers in low-lying and hillside communities alike spent the nights that followed sleeping outdoors, under tarpaulins, in open fields, too afraid of continuing aftershocks to go back inside buildings that might already be structurally compromised. Later that same Saturday, a separate, unrelated magnitude, 6.9 earthquake struck Indonesia's Sumatra region, thousands of kilometers away. with no immediate reports of damage. Seismologists say the two events were unconnected, but the coincidence underscored just how relentlessly active Indonesia's geology is at any given moment. The USGS issued what it classifies as a yellow alert for shaking-related fatalities and losses, meaning some casualties and damage were expected, manageable through local or regional response. But that alert level was set from preliminary shaking models before the true scale of the human toll became clear through days of ground search. The USGS had flagged something that turned out to be tragically accurate. The population here lives predominantly in structures vulnerable to shaking, unreinforced brick with concrete floors, and precast concrete frames with masonry infill walls. These building types do not flex. They break. And when they break, they collapse suddenly, which helps explain why so many deaths came from failing buildings rather than the tsunami itself. The agency also flagged landslides as a major secondary hazard given the mountainous terrain, a warning that proved devastatingly accurate as slope failures blocked roads and, in the hardest-hit regencies, buried homes and communication lines alike. Now I want to zoom out and explain why Flores, specifically why this island, this fault, this stretch of ocean, keeps appearing again and again in the history of major earthquakes. Indonesia sits at one of the most geologically complex intersections on Earth. The archipelago, a nation of more than 270 million people, spread across roughly 17,000 islands, sits at the collision point of three major tectonic plates: the Eurasian Plate, the Pacific Plate, and the Indo-Australian Plate. The entire country lies within the Pacific Ring of Fire, the horseshoe-shaped zone of intense seismic and volcanic activity that encircles the Pacific Ocean and accounts for roughly 90% of the world's earthquakes. Indonesia does not simply sit somewhere within that ring. It sits at one of its most complex and active sections. Flores Island specifically is shaped by the Flores Back Arc Thrust Fault, running east to west along the island's north side, formed by the subduction of the Indo-Australian Plate beneath the Eurasian Plate at that steady 80 millimeters a year. That sounds small, but over geological time it builds tremendous stress, and when that stress finally releases, it releases catastrophically. The eastern segment of this fault famously ruptured in the 1992 disaster. Scientists have long noted that other segments of the system have remained locked, quietly storing energy for decades, and this event occurred along one of those long, quiet stretches. The 1992 earthquake remains the benchmark that every scientist and every Flores resident carries with them. Same magnitude, same fault region, and a death toll that reached as high as 2,500, with waves cresting at nearly 9 stories high in some locations along the coast. Entire villages on small offshore islands were essentially erased by that tsunami surge. It remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in Indonesian history, and it is worth noting this was not even the only recent tremor along this exact stretch of coastline. A magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck the Flores Sea in December of 2021, killing one person and injuring more than 170, a reminder that this fault system rarely stays quiet for long. The people of Flores Island have lived with the memory of 1992 for more than 3 decades, building it into how they teach their children, how coastal communities are organized, and the evacuation drills emergency managers try to maintain. And when the ground shook this time, the same magnitude, the same fault, the same coastline, those people did not wait for someone to tell them what to do. Many moved instantly, on instinct built from inherited memory. That collective muscle memory is very likely one of the reasons this disaster, as devastating as it has been, did not repeat the raw scale of 1992's death toll in the tsunami itself. The overwhelming majority of confirmed deaths in this event came from collapsed buildings and landslides on land, not from a wall of ocean water sweeping through villages, which is precisely the outcome a functioning early warning system and an evacuation-trained population are designed to prevent. BMKG's monitoring and alert infrastructure has been significantly upgraded since 2004, the year the Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami killed nearly 230,000 people across 14 countries, including well over 160,000 in Indonesia alone. That catastrophe forced a complete rethinking of how Indonesia monitors, warns, and responds to seismic threats, and the system today is faster and far better connected to local emergency managers than anything that existed before. The rapid warning seen this time, with tsunami arrival estimates distributed across 4 provinces within minutes, is a direct product of that transformation. And still, the human cost of this disaster is severe in being tallied. Confirmed deaths climbed from an initial handful at the Maumere port to over 60 within 48 hours, and authorities have warned the number is expected to rise further as crews reach communities still cut off by landslides. Rescue and relief workers have been distributing rice, ready-to-eat meals, drinking water, blankets, and medicine to the roughly 5,000 people, forced into temporary shelters, many of them sleeping under open sky rather than risk aftershocks inside damaged homes. Restoring electricity and communications, and delivering aid to remote villages isolated by blocked roads have been described by officials as among the biggest ongoing challenges. Multiple commercial flights into East Nusa Tenggara province were cancelled in the immediate aftermath, complicating the movement of aid and personnel onto the island. Military and search and rescue agency personnel, working alongside 3 deployed helicopters, have been combing through collapsed structures searching for anyone still trapped. A painstaking process made harder by continuing aftershocks that make rescuers wary of entering already weakened buildings. The broader picture matters too. Indonesia has experienced multiple significant earthquakes already in 2026 alone. In April, a magnitude 7.3 to 7.4 quake struck North Maluku, killing at least 1 person, damaging more than 450 structures, and generating a 75-centimeter tsunami. In February, a smaller quake in Pacitan, East Java, killed 1 person and injured 47 others. Each is a reminder that the Ring of Fire operates on its own schedule, indifferent to human plans, budgets, or timelines. What happened on Flores this August was not a random event. It was the predictable, if unpredictable in timing, consequence of Indonesia's location on one of the most seismically active fault systems on the planet. Scientists have pointed at the Flores back arc thrust for years, flagging its locked segments, its proximity to dense coastal populations, and the history of what happened the last time a 7.7 magnitude rupture tore through this exact stretch of coastline. The earthquake itself could not be predicted or prevented. The response, the warnings, the evacuations, the decades of institutional learning that shaped how quickly help arrived. Those variables could be shaped, and in large part they were. That does not erase the loss of dozens of confirmed lives, or repair the broken homes in Riung, or undo the terror of 500,000 people experiencing severe ground shaking in the pre-dawn hours of a Saturday morning. It does not make the wait easier for families in Nagakeo Regency, still cut off by landslides days later, wondering when help will finally reach them. But it is very likely the reason this disaster did not repeat the full scale of the tragedy that struck this same coastline in 1992, when the same magnitude of earthquake on the same fault killed roughly 2,500 people, most of them in a tsunami that arrived before anyone had the chance to run. As of the days following the quake, Indonesia remains in active response mode. BNPB is coordinating disaster assessment teams across the hardest hit regencies. Local officials are managing crowded evacuation centers while continuing to monitor aftershock activity that shows little sign of fully settling down. BMKG continues tracking seismic signals across the region around the clock. And on Flores Island itself, people who lived through 1992 and people experiencing something like this for the first time are beginning the long, exhausting process of figuring out what comes next, how to rebuild homes that have already been rebuilt once before, how to bury the dead, and how to keep living on ground that has proven twice now within living memory that it cannot be trusted to stay still. If you're watching this and wondering what you can do, the most valuable thing right now is simply staying informed. Indonesia's disaster response capacity depends significantly on sustained international attention and support in the weeks that follow, long after the initial headlines fade. Organizations, including the Indonesian Red Cross, known locally as PMI, along with international partners and United Nations disaster coordination bodies, have already begun assessing needs on the ground. As the situation develops over the coming days, the needs of affected communities will only become clearer, and that is precisely when support tends to matter most, once the cameras have largely moved on. This is still a developing story. The numbers will almost certainly keep changing. Damage assessments will keep growing as rescue teams reach more isolated areas. The aftershock sequence will keep evolving, day by day, week by week. The full human cost of this earthquake is not yet fully known. What is known right now is this. A magnitude 7.7 earthquake struck the Flores region of eastern Indonesia at 5:58 in the morning on August 15th, 2026. It was shallow. It was violent. It generated a tsunami warning across 4 provinces. It killed dozens of people, with the confirmed toll climbing past 60 within days and expected to rise further. It damaged well over 1,000 homes and dozens of schools and hospitals across the island. It sent hundreds of thousands of people running for higher ground in the dark. And it ruptured along the very same fault that produced this exact scenario back in 1992, when 2,500 people lost their lives. I want to close by talking about something that does not get enough coverage in stories like this, the human experience of actually living through a major earthquake. Not the seismology, not the policy, just what it feels like to be on Flores Island on a morning like this one. Indonesia is not a country that treats earthquakes as abstract events. This is a place where the phrase Ring of Fire is the lived reality of daily life for hundreds of millions of people. Indonesian children in high-risk zones grow up doing earthquake drills the way children elsewhere do fire drills. The vocabulary of disaster, evacuation routes, safe assembly points, tsunami inundation maps is embedded into community planning in a way most people in geologically stable regions never have to think about. Flores Island in particular carries an unusually heavy burden of seismic memory. The 1992 earthquake is not distant history there. It is family history. It is the story a grandmother tells about losing someone she loved. It is the scar on the landscape where a village used to stand before the tsunami came through. It is the reason certain communities were rebuilt on higher ground afterward, and the reason certain coastal stretches were never resettled at all. The geography of survival on Flores has been shaped by 1992 in ways that are still visible today, more than 3 decades later. So when the ground shook again this August, the response was not simply fear. It was fear layered on top of memory. It was muscle memory acting before the conscious mind had even finished processing what was happening. Get out. Get to high ground. Do not go toward the water. Because on Flores, that lesson was paid for once already in thousands of lives. There's also the question of what happens in the weeks after the emergency response fades from the headlines. Aftershocks this size can continue for months. Every tremor becomes a fresh question. Is this the next big one? Families who cannot return home keep sleeping in cars, open fields, and crowded shelters. Livestock are lost, crops are damaged in a largely agricultural region. Local economies, already fragile in rural Flores, are disrupted further by road damage, severed bridges, and workers who cannot reach their fields or jobs. The Momir port, one of the sites hit hardest, is an economic artery, since Flores connects to the rest of the archipelago mainly by sea. When a port sustains serious damage, the ripple effects touch food supply, medical access, and the movement of the rescue teams trying to help. Indonesia's government has well-established disaster response mechanisms in BNPB, BMKG, the Indonesian Red Cross, and provincial emergency offices, systems built after the 2004 tsunami and refined through disasters including Yogyakarta, Padang, and the 2018 Lombok and Palu quakes. Each became a lesson that shaped the capacity deployed here, but resources are finite, and the ongoing question facing Indonesia is whether preparedness can keep pace with seismic events, whether warning systems can reach the most remote communities before disaster does, whether vulnerable buildings can be retrofitted before the next rupture, and whether institutional knowledge can survive changes in government and budgets. These are not abstract policy questions. They will determine how the next chapter of this story unfolds, and how the next earthquake on this same coastline, because there will be one, plays out for the people living there. For now, the confirmed toll stands at dozens of lives lost in climbing, thousands displaced, and an island still absorbing aftershocks while it tries to bury its dead and rebuild what has already been rebuilt once before. That is the Indonesia earthquake of August 15th, 2026, a magnitude 7.7 strike on one of the world's most dangerous fault lines, a tsunami warning across 4 provinces, entire regencies cut off by landslides, a seminary where morning mass turned into a fight for survival, and a death toll that grew heavier with every passing day. As rescue crews reached villages the outside world had not even known were struggling. Keep watching, keep sharing, and keep Flores Island in your thoughts, because the people there are living through something words can only partially capture.